How do we learn about the past? It's Mrs. Mangan here, and today I'm going to talk to you about learning about history through the use of primary sources. So, I want you to think about all the different ways that you've learned about the past. I'm sure you've used the internet and been to websites where someone has written about something that's gone on in the past, or you might have gone to a place on a family vacation, like a landmark or a monument or a statue or fort or something that you've learned about the past. And sometimes we can learn about the past through the photographs we look at and the documents we examine, which is what we did earlier with Miss Luciano. So, what are the differences between those ways we've learned about the past? So, there's two different sources. One is called a primary source. A primary source is a firsthand account by someone who actually was there, who experienced it and who participated in it. So, if we look back to this time where we were out of school and we stayed home to keep others safe, and someone asked, what was that like back in 2020? We would be primary sources. We have firsthand knowledge about this time right now. Our newspapers from right now, our news articles, those are primary sources because we are living right in it. So, some examples of primary sources include letters, entries, film and videos, sound recordings, notebooks, travel logs, interviews, photographs, books, magazines, and newspaper articles that were written at that time, and architecture that was built at that time. So, if you've ever been to ancient Greece or to Rome and you've seen the beautiful architecture, those are primary sources. They were built at that time and can give us information about what life was like then. So that's what a primary source is. What is a secondary source? A secondary source is a secondhand account. This is created by someone who did not experience it firsthand and did not participate in the events or conditions being studied. What that means is it's someone who wrote the history book. They probably weren't there at the time, but they used primary sources to write the history book. Encyclopedias, databases on the library, those people who were the authors of these texts used primary sources to help them gather information, but they were not necessarily there at that time. If you're watching a movie about a historical event, that movie is not a primary source, but maybe they used old footage or maybe they interviewed people. They used primary sources to get that data. Also, biographies. Biographies are not written by the person who they were about. So, if I'm writing about Martin Luther King, I wasn't there with him. I wasn't at that time, but I would use a lot of primary sources to help me learn about him. But the biography that I write is a secondary source. What do you guys think about autobiographies? If I write a book about my own life, is that a primary source? Hmm, let your teacher know what you think. So I want you to ask yourself when you're determining whether it's a primary or secondary source, was the person telling the account, was the person telling the facts present at the event? If they were there, if they were living in that time, then that means it's a primary source. If they were not there, then it is probably a secondary source, and they used primary sources to help them gather information. So, primary source or secondary source? Let's give it a try. So, an email. What do you guys think? A primary source or a secondary source? If I send you an email, is that email a primary source or a secondary source? It's a primary source. You guys got the email in that time you were living it. Let's look at this next one. Who Was Susan B. Anthony by Nancy Harrison. So, knowing what we know about primary sources and secondary sources, this is a book that's written all about Susan B. Anthony. But was it written by Susan B. Anthony? No. It was written after the fact of her life. So this is a secondary source. I can still learn from it. I don't want you to think that secondary sources are not valuable because, of course, they are. And like I keep saying, they're using primary sources to gather information, but it is not considered a primary source. Inside that book might be news articles about Susan B. Anthony or photographs, and those are primary sources. But the Who Was book itself is a secondary source. So let's look at this textbook. It's called Retracing the Past, and it's all about the history of the American people. Do you think that this textbook is a primary source or a secondary source? It's a secondary source. Inside might have information from primary sources, but the textbook itself was written by somebody, Gary Nash and Ronald Schultz, that were not there during these revolutionary times or the Industrial Revolution, any of that. So they used primary sources to help them gather information, and then they created the textbook, which is a secondary source. Let's look at this postcard. Oh, it's all to Robbie. Hmm, this is the actual postcard. Was this postcard there at the time of the event? Yes. This is an artifact. This is something you can actually put your hands on, and it is not a copy, or it's written at the time. And even if it is a copy, it's a copy of something that was real, that was there, that was existing at that time. So we know this is is a primary source. It was there at the time of the event. So, what I'm going to have you guys do is after you stop this lesson, I'm going to put the link to this short tutorial that might just help wrap up what the difference is between primary and secondary sources. And then once you've watched this lesson, watch the YouTube video, head on over to Seesaw. There's going to be an activity there called primary and secondary sources. You're going to watch a video of a speech, and I want you to write, or I want you to say, using the microphone tool, what is this an example of? Is it an example of a primary source or a secondary source, and why? So today, third graders for social studies, you're going to watch this video, which you already are. Go ahead and watch the YouTube video summarizing primary and secondary sources, and head on over to Seesaw to see if the example I've put up is a primary or secondary source, and explain why. All right, third graders, I hope that you have a good first day talking about primary sources and that you learn a little bit. Bye.